Well, let's speak to Nader Hashemi, who's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. He joins us on Skype from Denver in Colorado in the U.S. Thank you so much for being with us. So many Arab leaders had distanced themselves from Bashar al-Assad since the uprising began in 2011. Why are we seeing this shift now? Why are some Arab countries making overtures now to Assad?
Well, I think they're trying to perhaps woo Assad away from his alliance with Iran. The number one priority for the Assad regime today, after crushing all opposition to his rule, is economic reconstruction. The West is not going to invest in that economic reconstruction, but there are very wealthy Arab states that do have the resources, the financial resources. And so I suspect part of the agenda here is to see whether whether Bashar al-Assad can be influenced financially with reconstruction aid in exchange for weakening his alliance with Iran.
How much influence does Iran still have over him?
Huge. If it wasn't for Iran's participation in the horrific war in Syria over the last 7 years, Bashar al-Assad would not be alive today. He certainly wouldn't be in power. So Iran has a huge amount of influence. I don't think at the end of the day that Bashar al-Assad will break his alliance with Iran and switch sides. But I think what's much more fundamental, and I think what's uniting Bashar al-Assad with other Arab states in the region is that Bashar al-Assad and other leaders of the Arab states in the Middle East share a common national security concern. And that national security concern is fear of their own populations, fear of democracy, fear of political change. So in that sense, they have a very common sort of set of concerns that they're trying to fight and push back against.
So where then does this leave the rebels that some of these Arab countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, have supported both financially and militarily against Assad? And is this then an acknowledgement of his victory in this conflict?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, as for the rebels, that story has long been past. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and other Gulf states that were backing the rebels have, largely withdrawn their support. Turkey is providing some support to rebels in Idlib. But I think there is now a general sense that Bashar al-Assad has won this war, notwithstanding his colossal war crimes and crimes against humanity. Right. And of course, that issue is not of concern to any of the Arab states because they have no interest in upholding human rights standards. So in that sense, there's a lot of, I think, common cause for collaboration and sharing strategies for regime survival.
Israel also appears to be softening its stance. Where does that leave its ally, the U.S., the Americans? They've long called for Assad to be removed from power. Is that now also out of question?
I mean, that issue, I think, was more rhetoric than substance. Under, President Trump, the policy that he is pursuing with respect to Syria is effectively to allow Russia and Iran to run the political, show in Damascus, with the United States having some military influence over the eastern part of Syria. But there's no attempt to, topple or remove Assad. That's a story that's long since passed, and now it's a question of what's the future of Syria. Right. And of course, the tragedy here is there's an assumption that Bashar al-Assad can be a stabilizing force in Syria, and of course that's simply myth. After 500,000 deaths and war crimes and crimes against humanity, to think that someone who presided over that situation could be a stabilizing force in a country like Syria is really wishful thinking.
What's the future of Syria, you ask, and also what's the future of the region as a whole? If Bashar al-Assad is being brought back into the fold, what impact on the geopolitical climate in the region and tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think the biggest beneficiary here in the preservation and the survival of Bashar al-Assad are really the forces of radical Islamic extremism. They will benefit from recruiting young people in refugee camps, from the millions of people who've been displaced, who can't go home. The regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia will remain, and there's a general sense that Iran has at least prevailed in the context of the Syrian theater of war. But there's other battles that, Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting over. I think the bigger question here is the future of the Middle East will be deeply destabilized because of the victory of a war criminal. To think that a war criminal could be a stabilizing force, as I just said a moment ago, is naive at best. It's wishful thinking, and it will simply set the stage for further violence and destabilization of the Middle East for many decades to come.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Very interesting to hear your thoughts on this. Nader Hashemi from the University of Denver joining us there from Denver. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.